On the night of the 26th of July, 1942, 37 German and Italian aircraft were burning on a single Egyptian airfield. The men who did it were fewer than 60 in number. They had no artillery, no air support, no armor. They had arrived in 18 open jeeps, driving through the desert in absolute darkness, with their headlights off. And the weapon in their hands, the weapon that turned that airfield into a graveyard in less than 15 minutes, was a gun that the Royal Air Force had thrown into a warehouse a year earlier and stamped with a single word: Obsolete. This is the story of how a discarded machine gun, forgotten in a wooden crate outside Cairo, became the most destructive weapon in the history of British Special Forces, and of the tall, half-paralyzed young officer who walked into a general's office on crutches and found a use for it. To understand why a weapon written off by the Royal Air Force became one of the most feared instruments in the North African desert, you have to go back nearly 10 years to a drawing office in Crayford, Kent, where a group of engineers at Vickers Armstrong's sat over blueprints trying to solve a problem that most of their contemporaries hadn't yet noticed. To understand why a weapon written off by the Royal Air Force became one of the most feared instruments in the North African desert, you have to go back nearly 10 years to a drawing office in Crayford, Kent, where a group of engineers at Vickers Armstrong's sat over blueprints trying to solve a problem that most of their contemporaries hadn't yet noticed. The problem was speed. In the early 1930s, aircraft design was accelerating faster than the weapons designed to shoot at it. The biplane era, the age of fabric-covered wings and open cockpits, of observers standing behind their pilots with a rifle or a light machine gun on a swivel mount, was ending. New aircraft were metal-skinned. They were fast. They dived at 400 miles per hour and pulled out at speeds that turned pilots gray. If you were a rear gunner in an open turret on a British bomber, and an enemy fighter came screaming down out of the sun at you, you had perhaps half a second to put rounds into it before it flashed past and was gone. Half a second. A standard infantry machine gun, cycling at 300 or 400 rounds a minute, was almost useless in that window. By the time the bolt had traveled forward, chambered around, fired, extracted, and traveled back, the target had already disappeared behind you. The mathematics were brutal. In a fight measured in fractions of a second, a weapon measured in tenths simply could not compete. The engineers at Vickers Armstrong's understood this with absolute clarity. They needed something faster, not marginally faster, dramatically faster. Something that could throw a wall of lead into the sky in the smallest possible window of time. The answer lay in a weapon they already partly owned. The Vickers Berthier light machine gun had been adopted by the Indian Army in 1932. It was solid, it was reliable, It fired the standard 303 British cartridge, and it had a locking mechanism that was, by the standards of the time, unusually intelligent. Where the Bren gun locked its breech relatively early in the firing cycle, the Vickers Berthier locked at the very last moment of forward travel, just before the round fired. That detail sounds technical, but it opened a door. If the moving parts inside a Vickers Berthier could be made lighter, and the gas system tuned more aggressively, the bolt could travel faster in both directions without stressing the mechanism to failure. The engineers began stripping mass out of every non-essential component. They machined tolerances finer. They redesigned the bolt carrier to move on a shorter, faster stroke. They tuned the gas port beneath the barrel to bleed off just enough pressure to drive the piston hard, but not hard enough to shake the weapon apart. The result, when they finally tested it, was extraordinary. 900 rounds per minute. 1,000. 1,200 at its peak. Faster than the German MG-34. Faster than anything the Americans had. Faster than the Browning that was already being installed as the standard aircraft weapon in the Royal Air Force. They called it the Vickers gas-operated machine gun. In official ordnance documentation, it was designated Class K. In the mouths of the men who would carry it, it became something simpler. The Vickers K. It fired from a flat, circular pan magazine mounted on top of the receiver, holding 100 rounds, though gunners quickly learned to load only 96 or 97 to ensure clean feeding. The barrel had radial cooling fins machined into its surface. The whole weapon was compact enough for a man to swing on a flexible mount in a cramped bomber turret at 10,000 feet. In the mid-1930s, when the Royal Air Force ran competitive trials to select a new flexible defensive weapon, the Vickers K went up against the Browning. The Vickers K won. It was more reliable in the tests. Its rate of fire was extraordinary. Its magazine feed was clean and quick. And for a few short years at the end of that decade, it became the gun that guarded Britain's bombers. It rode in the observer positions of the Bristol Blenheim. It swung in the mid-upper turrets of the Armstrong, Whitworth, Whitley. It sat in the rear cockpit of the Ferry Battle, the nose position of the Handley Page Hampton, the flexible mountings of the Fleet Air Arms Swordfish, Albacore, and Barracuda. In the cold, dark spaces where a young gunner sat alone with the wind screaming past his canopy, waiting for the shape of a Messerschmitt to appear against the moon. The Vickers K was the answer. And then, almost overnight, it wasn't needed anymore. The war came in September of 1939, and in the year that followed, the direction of aircraft design shifted in a way that made the Vickers K's entire purpose obsolete. The Spitfire and the Hurricane, the fighters that would define British air power in the Battle of Britain, did not use flexible defensive guns. Their armament was fixed. 8 Browning machine guns, mounted in the wings, aimed by pointing the whole aircraft at the target. The pilot fought his aircraft the way a duelist fights with a saber. He aimed with his whole body, and in that role, in the tight confines of a wing bay where every inch of internal volume mattered, the Vickers K had a fatal flaw. The pan magazine. The drum sat on top of the receiver. It was wide. It was exposed. It was impossible to install cleanly inside the streamlined wing of a fighter aircraft. The Browning Mark II, belt-fed, low profile, could be packed into a wing bay with ammunition trays running the full length of the leading edge. The Vickers K could not. The very feature that had made the Vickers K excellent in a turret, that clean, quick-changing drum, made it useless in a wing. By 1940, the Royal Air Force had made its decision. The Browning would be the standard. The Vickers K would be replaced. Turrets on new bomber designs would use different weapons. The Fleet Air Arm held onto the K a little longer because slow maritime aircraft still needed flexible defensive armament and had space for the drum. But for the main combat aircraft of the RAF, the Vickers K was finished. Thousands of them were pulled from service, cleaned, greased, packed into crates, shipped to depots across Britain and the Middle East. The paperwork was blunt, obsolete, surplus to requirements. They would sit in their crates until someone decided what to do with them. And in the summer of 1941, nobody had. In a hospital ward in Cairo, in June of that year, a very tall young man lay on his back, in a bed that was not quite long enough for him, staring at the ceiling and trying to move his legs. His name was David Stirling. He was 25 years old. He was 6 feet 6 inches tall, so tall that his fellow officers had given him the nickname the Giant Sloth, a reference to both his height and his reputation for laziness during training. He was a lieutenant in the Scots Guards, seconded to the commandos, and he was furious. He was furious because he could not move his legs. He had been temporarily paralyzed from the waist down after an unauthorized parachute jump he had made without proper training. The parachute had caught on the tail of the aircraft. He had come down too hard, and now he was lying in a bed in Cairo while the war moved on without him. But he was not thinking about his legs. He was thinking about Rommel. He was thinking about the long, thin lines of the Africa Korps supply route stretched hundreds of miles along the Libyan coast, dotted with airfields that sat exposed under the desert stars. He was thinking about how much damage a very small number of men moving quietly could do to a very large number of aircraft parked in neat rows. He was thinking that the entire British Army in North Africa was fighting the wrong kind of war. On a scrap of paper, with a pencil that a nurse had brought him, he began to write. He wrote for days. When he could sit up, he wrote sitting up. When he could stand, he wrote standing. And when he could finally walk, on crutches, unsteady, one leg still not entirely his own, he did something that no junior officer in the British Army was supposed to do. He went straight to the top. He hobbled out of the hospital, made his way across Cairo in the July heat, and arrived at the perimeter of Middle East headquarters. The guard at the gate did not know him. He had no appointment. He was told to leave. Stirling did not leave. He waited until the guard was distracted, and he squeezed through a gap in the wire. He walked on his crutches through the corridors of the headquarters building until he found the office of the Deputy Commander, Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie. He was 44 years old, a career soldier, and he had never met David Stirling in his life. Stirling put the paper on his desk. Ritchie read it. 3 days later, Stirling was back, this time with a formal pass, and he put his case to the Commander-in-Chief himself, General Sir Claude Auchinleck. He was 57 years old. He was, at that moment, one of the most powerful military figures in the British Empire. Auchinleck read the proposal. He approved it. Stirling was promoted to captain. He was given permission to recruit 6 officers and 60 men. And he was given a name for his new unit, chosen not because it described what the unit was, but because it described what British intelligence wanted the Axis to think it was. Special Air Service Brigade, L Detachment. There was no brigade. There was no detachment before this one. The name was a fiction, invented not by deception, but by a brilliant deception officer named Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, who ran the Strategic Deception Unit A Force in Cairo. Clark had been inventing fictional units for months, feeding fake intelligence to the Axis to make them believe the British had a large airborne force operating in the Mediterranean. Stirling's unit was real. The brigade around it was not. Every man Stirling recruited would, on paper, appear to be part of a much larger organization that existed only in the imaginations of German intelligence analysts. It was the beginning of the most successful deceptions in the history of special operations. Stirling began to recruit. He went first to a man named John Steele Lewis, known to everyone as Jock. Lewis was 27 years old. He had been born in Calcutta, in British India, where his father worked. He had grown up in Sydney, Australia. He had rowed for Oxford at Christ Church College. He was an intellectual and a serious man, and he had already been experimenting on his own with the design of a small explosive device that could be carried in a haversack and placed on an aircraft to destroy it. The device would become known as the Lewis bomb. It combined plastic explosive with thermite and diesel oil, and it burned hot enough to punch through the aluminum skin of an aircraft and ignite whatever fuel remained in its tanks. 1 bomb per aircraft. That was the doctrine Lewis was building. Stirling and Lewis had trained together on the same failed parachute course. They understood each other. Then Stirling went to find Robert Blair, Mayne. Paddy Mayne was 26 years old. He was from Newtownards in Northern Ireland. He had been a solicitor before the war. He was 6'3", built like a cliff, and he had played rugby for Ireland and for the British Lions on their 1938 tour of South Africa. He was also, at the moment, Stirling found him, sitting under close arrest. Mayne had punched his commanding officer. He had punched him hard enough that the man had gone down and stayed down. Stirling walked into the tent where Mayne was being held. He explained what he was building. He told Mayne he needed men who could do things other men would not do. Mayne looked at him. He agreed. Now Stirling had his officers, he had his men, he had his idea. What he did not have yet was a way to make the idea work. He also did not know, on that day in July of 1941, that the answer to his problem was already sitting in a warehouse 40 miles east of him, wrapped in oiled canvas, packed in wooden crates that no one had opened in months. The first operation was called Squatter. It was scheduled for the night of the 16th of November, 1941, coordinated to support a larger offensive by the 8th Army against Rommel's positions in Libya. The plan was simple in concept and reckless in execution. 55 men, 5 aircraft, parachute drops behind enemy lines deep in the desert, hundreds of miles from any friendly force. The men would land, march to a series of Axis airfields along the coast, place their loose bombs on parked aircraft, and disappear back into the desert to be picked up by trucks from the long-range desert group. That was the plan. The desert had other ideas. On the afternoon of the 16th, as the aircraft were being loaded, the weather began to change. The wind picked up. The barometer fell. By the time the transports were airborne, a storm was rising across the North African coast that meteorologists would later describe as the worst in 30 years. The aircraft flew into it because Stirling insisted the operation could not be delayed. They jumped in wind speeds that made a controlled parachute descent impossible. Men were scattered across dozens of miles of desert. Equipment containers vanished into the sand. Radios were lost. Weapons were lost. Some men were killed on landing when their parachutes did not open properly in the turbulence. Others broke bones and lay in the dark, waiting for a rescue that could not find them. Of the 55 men who had jumped, only 22 made it back to the rendezvous point. Jock Luce was not among the dead of that first operation, but he would not last long. On the 30th of December, 1941, during the withdrawal from a subsequent raid, the truck he was riding in was attacked by a German Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter. Lewis was hit. He died in the desert at 27 years old, the inventor of the bomb that would destroy hundreds of aircraft he would never see burn. Back at Cabrit, in the barracks where Detachment had trained, David Stirling sat down and considered what he had built. He had lost more than half his men on the first operation. He had lost one of his 3 officers. The army wanted to disband the unit. There were serious voices in Cairo saying that Stirling's experiment had failed, that special operations of this kind were a waste of resources, and that the survivors should be returned to their parent regiments. Stirling did not accept it. He had seen in the wreckage of Operation Squatter a lesson that he believed the doubters could not see. The parachute was the wrong tool. The desert was not something to be dropped into. It was something to be crossed. And there were men in the desert already. Quiet men with dark faces and long beards who knew how to cross it. He was about to meet them, and the weapon that would arm his war was already waiting for him, 40 miles away in the dark. The men who saved what was left of David Stirling's ambition did not look like soldiers. They looked like something older than that, something that belonged to the desert itself. Their skin was burned dark by the sun. Their beards were long and stiff with sand. They wore Arab headscarves wrapped around their faces and their trucks. Canvas-topped Chevrolets and Fords, stripped of everything unnecessary, were painted in the colors of the ground they crossed. They moved by night. They navigated by the stars, using an instrument called a sun compass that one of them had invented himself. They could travel 1,000 miles across country that had no roads, no water, no landmarks, and arrive within 100 yards of a point they had marked on a map 2 weeks earlier. They were the long-range desert group. Their founder was a Royal Engineers officer named Ralph Alger Bagnold. He was 45 years old in 1941. Before the war, he had been an explorer. He had crossed the Libyan desert in Model T Fords in the 1930s. He had written scientific papers on the physics of blown sand that were still being read 50 years later by NASA engineers studying dust storms on Mars. He understood the desert the way a fisherman understands the tide. When Bagnold learned what had happened to Stirling's men on Operation Squatter, he offered him a partnership. The long-range desert group would carry the SAS in. They would carry them out. Bagnold's navigators would deliver Stirling's raiders to within walking distance of any airfield along the coast, and they would be waiting in the desert at a prearranged point on a prearranged night to bring the survivors back. Stirling accepted immediately. It was the moment his war began to work. On the night of the 14th of December, 1941, a small column of trucks moved through the desert toward the coastal airfield at Tamat in Libya. In one of those trucks sat Paddy, Mayne. He was carrying a haversack full of loose bombs. He was carrying a Colt automatic pistol. He was carrying nothing else. The trucks stopped in the darkness a few miles from the airfield. Mayne and his men, 4 of them in total, walked the rest of the way on foot. They came in from the seaward side, where the sentries were fewer. They crossed the perimeter without being seen. They lay in the sand for a long time, listening. From a low building near the runway came the sound of voices, laughter, a gramophone playing, the officers' mess. Mayne stood up. He walked across the open ground toward the light coming from the doorway of the mess. His men followed. He kicked the door open. Inside, German and Italian aircrew were sitting at tables. Some were eating, some were playing cards. One was pouring wine. They looked up at the enormous figure standing in the doorway with a pistol in each hand. Mayne opened fire. What happened in the next few minutes has been recorded in official histories and personal memoirs. But the essential fact is not in dispute. The men in that room were the crews who flew the aircraft parked outside. Mayne shot them where they sat. Then he walked out into the night and began placing bombs on their aircraft. His men moved along the parked line, laying charges on wings and engine cowlings, setting fuses timed to detonate together. Aircraft after aircraft. 20 of them. 22. 23. Then Mayne came to the last aircraft and he was out of bombs. There was one machine left, a Caproni, sitting silent in the moonlight. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he climbed into the cockpit. Paddy Mayne, 6'3", a rugby forward, with hands the size of dinner plates, reached down inside the cockpit of a 2-ton military aircraft and put his fingers around the instrument panel. And he tore it out. Wires snapped. Metal groaned. He wrenched it free with the same strength he had once used to break men on the rugby fields of Ireland, and he threw it out of the cockpit onto the ground. 24 aircraft destroyed in a single night. When Mayne and his men slipped back into the desert, the first of the timed fuses was already beginning to burn. They were half a mile out when the sky lit up behind them. By the spring of 1942, the raids were multiplying. Different targets, different airfields. Marble Arch, Nophelia, Birka, Bars. The SAS was proving that Stirling's concept was not a fluke. Small teams, deep penetration, aircraft burning on the ground where they could not fight back. The Axis commanders were paying attention. They were changing the way their airfields worked. Sentries were posted, no longer at the perimeter alone, but beside individual aircraft. Wooden towers went up along the runways with searchlights on top. Perimeter patrols were doubled, then tripled. Machine gun positions were dug in at intervals along the fence lines. The quiet, careful raids that had made the SAS famous, the ones where 4 or 5 men crept in on foot, placed their bombs, and vanished, were becoming impossible. The airfields were no longer sleeping when the SAS arrived. Stirling saw the problem coming, and he knew what it meant. If he could not get in unseen, then the whole doctrine had to change. He could not simply add more men. Adding men meant adding footprints, adding noise, adding chances of being detected. What he needed was the opposite: speed, shock, overwhelming firepower delivered in a window so brief that the defenders could not organize a response. he needed to drive onto the airfields. He needed vehicles fast enough to cross open ground under fire, small enough to slip through gaps in the perimeter, and capable of carrying enough weaponry to suppress an entire airfield defense in the few minutes before his men escaped back into the dark. And in the middle of 1942, that vehicle arrived, the Willys Jeep. It came from the Americans, part of the flood of Lend-Lease materiel that was beginning to reach British forces in the Middle East. It weighed just over a ton. It could carry 4 men and their equipment. It could climb almost anything. It could be repaired in the field with hand tools. And crucially, it was cheap and available in numbers. Stirling took one look at it and began stripping it down. The windscreens came off. They caught the moonlight and gave away position. The bumpers came off. The spare wheel was repositioned. Extra fuel cans and water jerrycans were bolted to every surface that could hold them, because in the desert, a raiding party lived or died by the range of its vehicles. Sand channels were strapped to the sides. Ammunition boxes were welded to the floor. What Stirling was building was not a Jeep anymore. It was a small, fast, mobile fortress, a fighting platform on 4 wheels, but it needed guns, and the guns had to be extraordinary. They had to fire fast enough to sweep an entire airfield in a single pass. They had to be reliable in the sand and the heat, where a jammed weapon meant a dead crew. They had to be light enough to mount on a Jeep without wrecking its balance. And they had to feed cleanly from magazines that could be changed in the dark at speed. Nobody was making a gun like that. Nobody needed to, because the gun already existed, and it was sitting, wrapped in oiled canvas, in the warehouses of Royal Air Force depots all across the Middle East. The story of who first suggested it varies depending on which memoir you read. Some accounts credit an SAS sergeant named Bob Bennett, an experienced soldier who had come across the Vickers K during earlier service and remembered what it could do. Other accounts credit an unnamed armorer at Cabrit who mentioned to Stirling in passing that there were crates of the guns sitting a few hundred yards away, doing nothing. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Stirling had one of the crates opened. Inside, wrapped in grease, paper, and canvas, was a machine gun that had been designed a decade earlier by engineers who had never imagined a desert, never imagined a Jeep, never imagined the man who was now looking down at their creation and calculating exactly what it could do for him. And the Vickers K, the specifications had not changed. Up to 1,200 rounds per minute. A 100-round drum that a gunner could swap in seconds. A mechanism designed by men who had built it to function at 10,000 feet in cold that could freeze engine oil. Every quality that had made it excellent in the sky translated to the desert. The gas-operated action, which relied on propellant gas bled from the barrel to cycle the bolt, was almost indifferent to sand. Where a belt-fed weapon could jam if a single grain of grit lodged in the feed tray, the Vickers K would keep firing. The drum magazine, which had killed the gun's future in fighter wings because it was too tall for a streamlined cowling, was perfect for a Jeep because it sat clean on top of the receiver where a gunner could swap it in the dark without fumbling for a belt. The rate of fire meant that a single Vickers K could put 20 rounds into a target in 1 second. 1 second. 20 rounds. Stirling did the mathematics in his head, and he began to smile. He ordered the crates opened. All of them. Every Jeep in the SAS motor pool received a pintle mount welded to the front bulkhead, directly in front of the passenger seat. On that mount, side by side, were bolted 2 Vickers K machine guns, wired together with a single trigger so that both fired simultaneously. 40 rounds per second. A third Vickers K was often mounted on a rear pintle behind the driver, giving each Jeep 3 guns and, when all were firing together, a combined rate of over 3,000 rounds per minute from a single vehicle. When a column of 18 Jeeps drove in formation, and every gunner opened up at once, the mathematics of violence became something almost incomprehensible. 50,000 rounds per minute, enough tracer fire to make the desert night look like daylight, enough lead to strip the skin from an entire flight line of parked aircraft in a single pass. The tracer ammunition itself was chosen with care. 1 round in 3, or 1 in 4, was loaded with a phosphorus compound that burned bright orange in flight. In the darkness, this served 2 purposes. It let the gunner see where his rounds were going, so he could walk his fire onto the target by watching the trajectory. And when a tracer round struck an aircraft, it did not simply punch through the aluminum skin. It ignited whatever fuel was inside. A parked bomber, sitting quiet on the flight line with its tanks full for the next day's mission, was not merely vulnerable to tracer fire. It was catastrophically vulnerable. A short burst in the right place would turn 20,000 pounds of aircraft into a fireball that lit up the horizon. Stirling had his weapon. Now he needed a target big enough to prove what it could do. He found it in July of 1942. The airfield at Sidi, Haneish, sat in the western desert of Egypt, roughly 300 miles west of Cairo, deep in territory that Rommel's Africa Corps had been contesting for months. It was a major logistical hub. Intelligence reports indicated that it held a large concentration of aircraft, most of them Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, the 3-engined workhorses that Rommel was using to fly fuel and ammunition to his forward positions. There were also Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers on the field, and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, the aircraft that had contested British air superiority over the desert for 2 years. Everything Rommel needed to keep his army moving was sitting on that airfield. Stirling assembled 18 jeeps, every one of them mounted twin Vickers K guns on the front and single Vickers K guns on the rear. The crews were briefed in the shade of a truck canopy at a hidden desert camp 50 miles from the target. Stirling drew the plan of attack in the sand with a stick. 2 parallel columns, 9 jeeps in each. Drive onto the airfield at speed. Open fire the moment the first aircraft came into view. Sweep the length of the flight line. Turn at the end. Sweep back the other way. Then out into the desert before the defenders could recover. The men listened. They did not say much. At sunset, on the 26th of July, 1942, the column began to move. They drove without headlights in absolute darkness, guided across 50 miles of open desert by a navigator using a sun compass and dead reckoning. There was no moon that night. The stars burned overhead, sharp and cold. The engines were muffled with cloth. The men in the jeeps did not speak. For 3 hours they moved. At just after midnight, the navigator raised a hand. The airfield was ahead. Stirling stopped the column and stood up in his jeep. He could see, in the far distance, the low silhouettes of hangars and the darker shapes of parked aircraft along the flight line. And then, without warning, the runway lights came on. Bright white lights running the length of the runway, illuminating the aircraft parked on either side. For a moment, every man in the column believed they had been detected. They had not. The lights were on because a Luftwaffe bomber, returning from a mission, was coming in to land. The airfield had lit up to guide it down. In the sky above them, they could hear faintly the drone of engines. Stirling looked at his watch. He looked at the runway. He looked at the men in the jeeps beside him. Then he fired a green flare from a pistol he carried in his belt. The column moved. 18 jeeps in 2 parallel lines, accelerating toward the lit runway of a fully awake Axis airfield. The drivers pressing their engines hard, the gunners bracing behind their twin Vickers K mounts, the tracer rounds already loaded, the safeties already off. They crossed the perimeter at speed. Stirling fired the green flare a second time. Every gun on every jeep opened fire at once. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical presence in the air. Up to 1,200 rounds per minute from 36 guns at the front of 18 vehicles, plus the rear guns firing outward, plus the tracer rounds arcing in every direction, plus the first aircraft exploding as fuel tanks ignited and secondary explosions rippled down the flight line. Ground crews came running out of tents and hangars and were cut down where they stood. Anti-aircraft positions on the perimeter opened up, but the jeeps were moving too fast for the gunners to track. The columns swept down both sides of the runway, firing continuously, tracer rounds cracking into the wings and fuselages of parked junkers, into the engines of Stukas. into the fuel Bowsers standing between the aircraft. The airfield was on fire. At the far end of the runway, the columns turned. They came back. They fired again on the return pass, hitting anything still standing, anything not yet burning, anything that might have survived the first sweep. Aircraft that had been damaged but not destroyed took a second burst and went up. One Jeep was hit. Its engine died. The crew was pulled aboard other vehicles. One man was killed. His name was Guardsman John Robson. He was struck in the head by a burst of return fire and died in the Jeep beside his gun. Then the columns were through, back out into the desert, engines roaring, tracer rounds still arcing overhead as they disappeared into the darkness. Behind them, on the airfield at Sidi Haneish, at least 37 aircraft were burning. In the hours after the raid, as the survivors of the Axis garrison tried to piece together what had happened, the reports that went back to headquarters were confused and contradictory. One garrison officer, in a communication that would later be captured by British intelligence, reported that the airfield had been attacked simultaneously by naval commandos landed from the sea, airborne troops dropped from the sky, and armored vehicles that had penetrated the perimeter from the desert. In reality, it had been 18 jeeps, fewer than 60 men, driving in open vehicles, without armor, without air support, without heavy weapons of any kind, only speed and surprise, and the terrible, magnificent rate of fire of a gun that the Royal Air Force had put in a crate a year earlier and labeled surplus to requirements. In Berlin, in the autumn of 1942, a name began to appear in intelligence reports that landed on the desks of senior officers in the German High Command. The Phantom Major, that was what they called him. The man responsible for the burning airfields. The man whose small teams appeared out of the desert without warning, destroyed 100 aircraft in an hour, and vanished before dawn. The man who was making a joke of Rommel's supply lines and who could not be found by any patrol, any aerial reconnaissance, any informant network. Erwin Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, the field marshal, whose reputation was the pride of the German army, gave the order. Capture David Stirling, whatever it took, whatever units had to be assigned. The man was a priority target. It was an extraordinary compliment. It was also the beginning of the end for Stirling, because the Germans were now hunting him with the same intelligence, the same discipline, and the same ruthlessness that they applied to everything else they did. On the night of the 24th of January, 1943, David Stirling was asleep. He had been driving for days. His unit had crossed hundreds of miles of contested territory, moving through Tunisia to link up with the American First Army coming east from Algeria. It was a long, exhausting reconnaissance mission, and he had pulled his men into a wadi, a dry desert riverbed, to rest for a few hours before dawn. He did not know it, but the Germans had been tracking him. A specialized German unit had been formed for exactly this purpose. Its mission was to hunt British special forces operating deep behind Axis lines in the desert. They had been searching for Stirling for weeks. And that night, guided by a local informant, they closed in on the Wadi. They came at dawn. Stirling was still asleep in his sleeping bag when the first shots were fired. By the time he was on his feet, the Wadi was surrounded. Some of his men escaped into the desert. Stirling did not. He was captured wearing shorts and no shirt. The man who had raised the SAS from nothing, who had trained the finest raiders in the British Army, who had personally led the destruction of hundreds of Axis aircraft, was taken prisoner in his sleeping bag by a unit specifically created to catch him. The Germans could not believe their luck. They put him in a prison camp in Italy. He escaped. They caught him. They put him in another camp. He escaped again. They caught him a third time. They put him in a camp deeper inside the Reich. He escaped from that one too. Eventually, after multiple failed escape attempts, the German authorities gave up trying to hold him in conventional prisoner of war camps. They sent him to Colditz Castle, Oflag IVC, the fortress on the hilltop in Saxony that the Germans reserved for prisoners they had classified as impossible to hold anywhere else. David Stirling would spend the rest of the war in Colditz. He would never see another SAS raid. He would never see the units he had created liberate a French village or a Belgian farmhouse. He would sit in a cell in a medieval castle in Germany, and he would wait while the war he had helped to reshape moved on without him. The command of the SIS passed to Paddy Mayne. If David Stirling had been the architect of the SIS, Paddy Mayne became its terrifying executor. Where Stirling planned, Mayne killed. He led raids in Sicily, in Italy, in occupied France, in the Netherlands, in Germany itself. His personal courage under fire became a matter of legend. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order 4 times, one of the most decorated British soldiers of the entire war. By the end of the North African campaign, the numbers had become almost impossible to believe. The SAS and its associated units had destroyed more than 400 Axis aircraft on the ground. 400. That figure exceeded the total number of Axis aircraft shot down in aerial combat by the entire Desert Air Force over the same period. Every Spitfire, every Hurricane, every Kitty Hawk pilot who had flown against the Luftwaffe in North Africa, added together, had killed fewer enemy aircraft than a few dozen men in jeeps. Paddy Mayne's personal tally, according to the estimates that historians have been able to piece together from operational records, was over 100 aircraft destroyed. 100 aircraft. That number, if you compare it to the achievements of any fighter ace of the Second World War, is astonishing. No Allied pilot came close to it. The most successful American ace, Richard Bong, was credited with 40 aerial victories. The highest scoring British ace, Marmaduke Paddle, was credited with about 50. Paddy Mayne killed more aircraft than either of them. He killed them on the ground, in the dark, from the passenger seat of a Jeep, with Lewis bombs and Vickers K machine guns. The National Army Museum in London would later formally acknowledge that Mayne's personal count of aircraft destroyed exceeded that of any other individual on either side of the conflict. He achieved it because of the doctrine David Stirling had built, and he achieved it because of the gun that the Royal Air Force had thrown away. The reputation of the Vickers K spread beyond the SAS. The long-range desert group, which had originally served as the SCS's transport, adopted the gun for its own vehicles. Chevrolet trucks in LRDG service began to mount Vickers K guns in twin configurations, and later in triple mounts. The gun's resistance to sand contamination made it uniquely suited to the deep desert patrols the LRDG conducted. Where other weapons failed after prolonged exposure to grit, the Vickers K kept firing. In the coastal forces of the Royal Navy, the gun found a second life. From 1942 onward, the Vickers K began to replace the older Lewis gun on motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats, and motor launches operating in the English Channel, the Mediterranean, and eventually the Adriatic. The same qualities that made it valuable in the desert translated to the crowded decks of small naval vessels cutting through salt spray at 40 knots. A gun that would not jam from salt was not a luxury on a coastal forces boat. It was the difference between coming home and not. The airborne forces discovered it too. During Operation Market Garden in September of 1944, when the 1st Airborne Division dropped into the Netherlands to seize the bridges over the Rhine, the Divisional Reconnaissance Squadron carried Vickers K guns mounted on their jeeps. In the narrow country lanes around Arnhem, in the desperate fighting that would eventually see the Airborne Division cut off and destroyed, the Vickers K was still there, still firing. From the sand of Libya to the polders of Holland, the gun that had been declared obsolete was still doing what it had been built to do. Bernard Montgomery, the field marshal who had led the 8th Army to victory at El Alamein and beyond, was not a man given to extravagant praise. He was known for his cold, precise judgment of men and their capabilities. When asked after the war about David Stirling, Montgomery said something that would be quoted for the next 70 years. The boy Stirling is quite mad. Quite mad. However, in a war, there is often a place for mad people. It was a hard sentence. It was also, coming from Montgomery, the highest compliment he was capable of giving. The war ended in Europe in May of 1945. In August, Japan surrendered. David Stirling was released from Colditz Castle when American forces liberated it in April 1945. He came home to a Britain that was exhausted, half-ruined, hounds, and celebrating a victory it did not yet know how to live with. He was 30 years old. He would live for another 4 decades. He would work in Africa, in business, in politics. He would be knighted in 1990. He would die that same year. Paddy Mayne survived the war. He returned to Northern Ireland. He resumed his practice as a solicitor. He struggled with what we would now recognize as combat trauma. He drank heavily. He died in a car accident in Newtownards in December of 1955 at the age of 40. Some of his fellow SAS veterans would say, quietly, in the years afterward, that Mayne had come back from the war and had never really come home from it. The Vickers K itself had one last chapter. In October of 1945, the Fleet Air Arms 8 and 12 Naval Air Squadron was operating from carriers off the coast of Hong Kong, flying Ferry Barracuda aircraft on anti-piracy patrols in the South China Sea. Those aircraft still carried Vickers K guns in their flexible defensive positions. It was the last recorded operational use of the weapon in Royal Navy service. When those patrols ended, the Vickers K went into storage, then into museums, then into the private collections of men who understood what it had been. The Royal Air Force had declared it obsolete in 1940. By 1945, it had helped destroy more enemy aircraft than any weapon of its type in the Allied arsenal. The SAS that David Stirling founded in a Cairo hospital bed became the template for special operations units across the world. Delta Force in the United States, formed in 1977, drew directly on the SAS doctrine of small teams and disproportionate violence against high-value targets. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, formed in 1957, was modeled explicitly on Stirling's original unit. Special Forces units in Canada, New Zealand, France, Israel, and dozens of other nations traced some part of their operational philosophy back to what Stirling and Mayne had worked out in the Libyan desert between 1941 and 1943. Every one of those units, in some form, is a descendant of Detachment, and Detachment, in the years when it was writing the doctrine in blood and burning aircraft rather than in training manuals, depended on a gun that had been thrown away. The engineers at Vickers Armstrongs, who designed the Vickers K in the early 1930s, built it for one specific purpose. They built it to protect British bombers from the fast fighters that were beginning to appear over Europe. They built it for the sky. They never imagined a desert. They never imagined a jeep. They never imagined an Ulsterman with a haversack full of Lewis bombs, or a 6'6" Scotsman on crutches walking into a general's office with a piece of paper, or a fleet of stripped-down American trucks driving in formation onto a lit runway at midnight. They built a weapon that was excellent, and then the world they had built it for stopped existing. The Royal Air Force did what institutions do. It looked at the direction of the future, decided that the Vickers K did not fit, and moved on. The paperwork was signed. The crates were sealed. The gun was set aside. But excellence does not expire simply because the men who commissioned it have lost interest. Good engineering has its own life. The qualities that make a machine truly excellent in one context often survive the context itself. A weapon that could fire up to 1,200 rounds a minute from a bomber turret in freezing air with engine oil misting the mechanism could also fire up to 1,200 rounds a minute from the front of a Jeep in the desert at midnight with sand in the... The gun did not know it was obsolete. The men who found it in the crates did not care. They took it out. They bolted it to a Jeep. They pointed it at the ground. And they used it to change a war. David Stirling died in 1990. Paddy Mayne died in 1955. Jock Lewis had been dead since 1941. Ralph Bagnold lived until 1990. Dudley Clark, the deception officer who invented the SAS brigade that never existed, died in 1974. Neil Ritchie, who had let a wounded lieutenant put a piece of paper on his desk, died in 1983. Claude Oceanleck, who had said yes to a plan that no one else believed in, died in 1981. They are all gone now. The Vickers K is gone too, in any operational sense. It sits in the display cases of the Imperial War Museum and the National Army Museum, and in the regimental collections of the units that carried it. Occasionally one appears at auction and is bought by a collector who understands what he is holding. But the idea it was part of, the idea that a small number of extraordinary men moving with speed and shock and overwhelming local violence can achieve results out of all proportion to their numbers, that idea has never gone away. It is the foundation of modern special operations. It began in a hospital bed in Cairo with a pencil and a piece of paper, and a young officer who was too tall for his bed and too impatient for the war he was in. It was carried by men who found their weapon in a crate labeled Obsolete, and it changed the way war would be fought for the rest of the century. The gun was written off, the soldiers were not, and in the space between what an institution discarded and what a few men were willing to pick up, an entire legend was made.